What happens when a billionaire CEO, surrounded by power but starving for love, approaches a fallen engineer working as a janitor with the most desperate request imaginable? Pretend you love me for 10 minutes. Tonight I'm sharing a story that will shatter your heart and rebuild it again. A tale of two broken souls who discovered that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most impossible lies. Stay with me until the very end, and don't forget to comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The 47th floor of Veyra Industries never slept. Even at 11:47 p.m. on a rain-soaked Thursday in November, the glass corridors hummed with the quiet intensity of ambition, monitors glowing like urban stars, the distant ping of elevators carrying night shift executives to their glass-walled kingdoms. But tonight, in the executive washroom adjacent to the corner office that commanded a view of half the city, something unprecedented was about to unfold. Selene Veyra stood frozen before the mirror, her reflection fractured by the harsh fluorescent lighting that made even her flawless makeup appear fragile. At 34, she was the youngest CEO in her industry's history, a woman who had clawed her way to the apex of a male-dominated empire with nothing but brilliant instincts and an iron will that had never once betrayed her. Her charcoal Armani suit was perfectly tailored. Her dark hair swept into the kind of elegant chignon that graced magazine covers, and her green eyes, those legendary emerald depths that could freeze a boardroom into submission, were rimmed with tears she refused to let fall. In 6 hours, she would stand before the annual shareholders' gala, delivering a speech that would determine whether she retained control of the company her parents had built from nothing. In 6 hours, she would smile for cameras, shake hands with men who whispered about her behind closed doors, and pretend that their whispered doubts about her leadership didn't cut deeper than any blade ever could. In 6 hours, she would be surrounded by hundreds of people and feel more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The door opened with a soft hydraulic whisper, and Selene's breath caught in her throat. She expected to see Margaret, her assistant, or perhaps one of the other executives burning the midnight oil. Instead, she found herself face to face with Adrian Cole, the night janitor whose presence had become as familiar as the building's architecture over the past 8 months. Adrian paused in the doorway, his dark eyes immediately registering her distress despite her efforts to compose herself. At 36, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that no amount of misfortune had managed to erode. His custodial uniform was clean but worn, his hands calloused from work that was so far beneath his capabilities it might have been criminal. But there was something about the way he moved, the way he observed the world around him, that spoke of a man who had once commanded respect in very different circumstances. "I'm sorry, Ms. Veyra," he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent that hinted at a childhood spent somewhere far from these gleaming towers. "I didn't realize anyone was still here. I can come back later." "No," Selene said too quickly, then caught herself. "I mean, please don't let me interrupt your work. I was just—" She gestured vaguely at the mirror as if her presence there required explanation. Adrian stepped inside, closing the door behind him with careful precision. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued its relentless assault against the floor-to-ceiling windows, each drop catching the city lights like falling diamonds. In the strange intimacy of the empty washroom with its marble surfaces and gold fixtures that cost more than most people earned in a year, something shifted between them. "You're afraid," Adrian said quietly, and it wasn't a question. Selene's carefully constructed mask slipped for just an instant, revealing the vulnerability she guarded so fiercely. That's an interesting observation from someone whose job description doesn't include psychological analysis. "My job description doesn't include a lot of things," Adrian replied with a hint of a smile that transformed his entire face. "But 8 months of cleaning these offices gives a man time to observe. And you, Ms. Veyra, are many things, brilliant, formidable, occasionally terrifying, but tonight you're afraid." She should have been offended. She should have reminded him of the professional boundaries that separated a CEO from custodial staff. She should have done any number of things that would have preserved the careful distance she maintained from everyone in her life. Instead, she found herself stepping closer to him, drawn by something she couldn't name. "The gala tomorrow," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. Have you ever felt like you're about to step onto a stage where everyone in the audience is waiting for you to fail? Every day for the past 3 years, Adrian answered without hesitation. Since the day I lost everything that mattered to me except for one thing. Since the day I went from being someone who designed aircraft engines to someone who empties trash cans in the building where aircraft engines are probably being designed. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Selene stared at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. The way he held himself, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the careful precision with which he spoke. Suddenly, his presence in her building felt less like coincidence and more like fate. "What happened?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she had the right to know. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the windows where the city sprawled beneath them like a circuit board of hopes and dreams. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ghosts. "I had a company, small but innovative. We developed guidance systems for commercial aircraft, the kind of technology that makes flying safer for millions of people. I had a team of 12 brilliant engineers, a daughter who thought her daddy could move mountains, and a wife who..." He paused, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "A wife who decided that our life together wasn't as appealing as the life she could have with my business partner." Selene felt something twist in her chest, a recognition of pain that mirrored her own in ways she hadn't expected. "They took everything." "Everything except Emma," Adrian said, and when he spoke his daughter's name, his entire expression softened. "She's 9 now. Every night when I come home from cleaning these offices, she asks me if I had a good day at work. And every night I tell her I did, because the alternative is explaining to a 9-year-old that sometimes the world takes everything you've built and leaves you with nothing but the determination to keep going." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Two people who had learned to carry their burdens alone, finding themselves in a space where pretense felt suddenly unnecessary. Selene had built walls around her heart that were higher than the towers outside these windows. But something about Adrian's honesty made her want to tear them down brick by brick. "Tomorrow," she said slowly, "I have to stand in front of 600 people and convince them that I deserve to lead the company my parents spent their lives building. And for the first time since I took over 3 years ago, I'm not sure I believe it myself." Why? The simple question cut through layers of complexity, reaching the heart of her fear with surgical precision. Selene looked at herself in the mirror again, but this time she saw something different. Not the polished executive who had conquered boardrooms and market shares, but the woman who went home every night to an empty penthouse and wondered if success was supposed to feel so much like solitude. "Because they're not wrong," she whispered. "The board members who think I'm too young, too inexperienced, too..." She gestured at herself with a bitterness that surprised them both. "Too much of everything they don't want in a leader. I've made mistakes, big ones. The Hartwell acquisition that cost us $40 million. The expansion into European markets that failed spectacularly. The product launch that..." She stopped herself, realizing she was cataloging her failures like a prosecutor building a case. "And your successes," Adrian asked gently, "don't matter. Not tomorrow. Tomorrow, Victor Doss is going to stand up in front of those shareholders and present them with a carefully crafted narrative about why the company needs experienced leadership and steady hands, and all the other euphemisms that mean someone who isn't me." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He's been planning this coup for months. I have documents, financial projections, a presentation that took my team weeks to prepare, but none of it addresses the real question, which is..." Selene met his eyes in the mirror, and in them she saw something she hadn't encountered in years, genuine concern without agenda. No hidden motives, no calculations about what her answer might mean for his career or his position. Just honest, human connection in a world that had forgotten such things existed. "Whether I deserve to be loved," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Whether anyone could look at me, really look at me beyond the title and the money and the power, and see someone worth caring about." The admission left her feeling exposed, as if she had stripped away every protective layer she had spent years building. She expected him to look away, to offer some platitude about her worth as a person, to retreat into the safe distance that separated their worlds. Instead, Adrian stepped closer. "May I tell you something, Ms. Veyra?" he said, and his voice carried a warmth that made her chest tighten. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "For 8 months, I've watched you through these windows. I've seen you stay until midnight solving problems that other executives would delegate. I've seen you take phone calls at 2 in the morning from employees who needed help with personal crises that had nothing to do with business. I've seen you slip bonuses into pay envelopes when you thought no one was looking, and I've watched you stand at these windows during thunderstorms, looking like you were trying to hold the whole world together with nothing but will and determination." His words washed over her like a benediction, each one settling into places in her heart that had been empty for so long she had forgotten they existed. "If someone can't see that you're worth loving," Adrian continued, "then they're not looking hard enough." The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, tracing silver paths down her cheeks. For a moment, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was someone in the world who could see her clearly and find her worthy of care. But reality intruded with the harsh fluorescent lighting and the distant hum of ambition that never slept. "It doesn't matter," she said, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Tomorrow I'll walk into that gala alone. I'll give my speech alone. I'll fight for my company alone, because that's what I do. That's who I am." "What if you didn't have to?" The question stopped her cold. She turned to face him, fully searching his expression for the joke she was certain must be hiding there. But Adrian's dark eyes were serious, thoughtful, as if he were working through a problem that required all of his considerable intelligence. "I don't understand." "Tomorrow night," he said slowly, "when you walk into that gala, what if you weren't alone? What if you had someone beside you who believed in you completely, who could stand with you against whatever Victor Doss thinks he's going to throw at you?" Selene felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, quickly followed by the crushing weight of reality. "Adrian, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," he interrupted gently. "I'm offering. You don't understand. This isn't just a dinner party. This is 600 of the most powerful people in the industry. Billionaires, politicians, celebrities. The kind of people who would eat someone like—" She stopped herself, realizing how her words might sound. "Someone like me," Adrian finished with a wry smile. "A janitor who used to be somebody else. That's not what I meant." "Yes, it is. And you're right." He moved to the window, looking out at the city that stretched endlessly below them. "But here's the thing about being somebody else. You learn that identity is more fluid than most people realize. 3 years ago, I wore $1,000 suits and made decisions that affected hundreds of employees. Tonight, I wear this uniform and empty trash cans. Tomorrow?" He turned back to her, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Tomorrow, I could be whatever you need me to be." The proposition hung between them like a challenge to everything Selene thought she knew about possibility. She stared at him. This man who had somehow seen through all her carefully constructed defenses to the lonely woman beneath, and felt something shift inside her chest. "You're talking about pretending," she said quietly. "I'm talking about giving you what you need to walk into that room with your head high and your confidence intact. If that requires pretending, then yes." They would see right through it. "The moment we walked in together, everyone would know. Would they?" Adrian moved closer again, and Selene caught the faint scent of his cologne, something clean and understated that spoke of careful choices made on a limited budget. What would they see a successful woman with a partner who clearly adores her? A CEO who has everything, including someone who believes in her enough to stand beside her in the most important moment of her career. The word partner sent an unexpected thrill through her, followed immediately by a surge of panic. This was insane. This was the kind of desperate measure that belonged in romantic comedies, not in the real world, where careers were built and destroyed by perception and reputation mattered more than truth. "I can't ask you to risk your job for me," she said. "My job cleaning offices." Adrian laughed, but there was no bitterness in it. "Ms. Veyra, if this doesn't work, I'll still be able to clean offices. But if it does work, if I can help you keep the company your parents built, then maybe it will be worth the risk. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why would you do this for me? Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on her face. When he spoke, his voice carried a sincerity that made her chest ache. Because 3 years ago, when I lost everything, I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to help someone else avoid that kind of destruction, I would take it. Because I have a daughter who needs to see that sometimes, when good people are in trouble, other good people step up to help. And because... He paused, something flickering across his expression that was too quick for her to interpret. Because you're worth it. The words settled into her heart like seeds in fertile soil taking root in places that had been barren for so long she had forgotten they could bloom. She looked at this man, this unexpected, impossible man who had somehow appeared in her life at the exact moment when she needed him most, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. What would we tell people? She asked, and even as the words left her lips, she couldn't believe she was considering this. The truth, Adrian said simply, that I'm someone who cares about you, someone who believes in you, someone who wants to see you succeed. And after tomorrow we go back to our lives. You run your company, He shrugged. I figure out what comes next for me and Emma. The mention of his daughter brought another wave of uncertainty. Adrian, I can't let you risk your stability for this. You have responsibilities. I have a responsibility to teach my daughter that sometimes you take risks for the right reasons, he interrupted. That sometimes you stand up for people who deserve better than they're getting. That sometimes... He smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Sometimes you get to be part of something extraordinary. Selene found herself studying his face in the harsh washroom lighting, memorizing the lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and loss in equal measure, the strong jaw that suggested determination, the mouth that had just offered her something she had never dared to hope for. In all her years of negotiating deals and reading people, she had never encountered anyone quite like Adrian Cole. I don't even know your last name, she said suddenly. Cole. Adrian Cole. Adrian Cole, she repeated, testing the sound of it. Former aerospace engineer, current custodial staff, and now... She trailed off, unable to find words for what he was offering to become. Now, someone who believes in you enough to stand beside you when it matters most, he finished quietly. The rain continued its assault against the windows, each drop a reminder of the storm that awaited her tomorrow. But for the first time in months, Selene felt something other than dread about the gala. She felt the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face it alone. 10 minutes, she said suddenly. I'm sorry. If we do this, if I let you help me, all I'm asking for is 10 minutes. 10 minutes where I can walk into that ballroom and feel like someone in the world believes I deserve to be there. 10 minutes where I'm not alone. Her voice broke slightly on the last word. Can you pretend to love me for 10 minutes? The question hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible distance. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel seen in ways she hadn't experienced in years. Selene, he said, and hearing her name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver through her. I don't think it would be pretending. The admission hit her like a physical force, stealing her breath and making her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with possibility. She stared at him, this man, who had somehow walked into her life at exactly the moment when she needed him most, and felt the first crack in the walls she had built around her heart. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. Neither do I, Adrian admitted. But I know how to stand beside someone who deserves better than she's been given. I know how to believe in someone who has forgotten how to believe in herself. And I know how to... He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. I know how to care about someone worth caring about. The space between them felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Selene had built her entire adult life around control, around careful calculation and measured risk. But standing here in this sterile washroom, with rain drumming against the windows, and a man who saw through all her defenses offering her something she had never dared to ask for, control, felt less important than courage. "Okay," she said, and the word came out like a breath. "Okay, Adrian Cole, help me." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after the longest night of her life. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, his fingers brushed against her cheek with a gentleness that made her eyes flutter closed. "We'll need a story," he said softly. "Something believable about how we met, how long we've been together." "The truth," Selene said, opening her eyes to find him watching her with an expression that made her chest tight. "We met here in this building. You saw something in me that I had trouble seeing in myself. You made me believe that maybe I was worth—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Worth loving," Adrian completed, and his thumb traced along her cheekbone with infinite care. "Worth standing beside, worth fighting for." The tears came again, but this time they felt different, not like the bitter drops of defeat she had shed before, but like something cleaner, something that washed away years of accumulated doubt and left room for something new to grow. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good," Adrian said with a smile. "Fear means it matters. Fear means we're about to do something that could change everything. What if it doesn't work? What if they see through us immediately?" "Then we'll have tried," he said simply. "And sometimes trying is enough." Selene looked at herself in the mirror one more time, but now she wasn't alone in the reflection. Adrian stood beside her, his hand still gentle against her face, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't look like a woman preparing to face her execution. She looked like a woman preparing to fight for something worth keeping, with someone worth fighting beside. "Tomorrow night," she said, and her voice was steadier than it had been all evening. 7 o'clock, the Meridian Ballroom. "I'll be there," Adrian promised. "You'll need formal wear, a tuxedo, probably something from—" She stopped, realizing she was about to make assumptions about his financial situation that would be both awkward and potentially hurtful. "I'll figure it out," he said easily, showing no offense at her half-finished statement. "I may not have much, but I know how to clean up when the situation calls for it." "Adrian." She caught his hand as he started to step away. "Thank you for seeing me, for offering to help, for—" She struggled to find words for what he had given her in the space of a single conversation. "For making me feel less alone." "You were never as alone as you thought you were," he said quietly. "Sometimes it just takes the right person to help you see that." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Selene, yes. Tomorrow night, when we walk into that ballroom together, remember something. You're not pretending to be worthy of love. You're just letting the world see what I've seen for months that you already are." With that, he slipped out of the washroom, leaving Selene alone with her reflection and a heart that felt fuller than it had in years. She stood there for a long time, watching the rain streak down the windows and thinking about the impossibility of what she had just agreed to do. In less than 24 hours, she would walk into the most important event of her professional life on the arm of a man she barely knew, trusting him with her reputation, her company, and her heart. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was completely contrary to every careful, calculated decision she had made in her adult life. It was also, she realized with a small smile, the first time in years that she was looking forward to tomorrow. The morning light filtering through Selene's penthouse windows felt different somehow, as if the conversation from the night before had altered the very quality of illumination in her world. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass coffee growing cold in her hands, watching the city wake up 43 stories below. Somewhere in that maze of concrete and ambition, Adrian Cole was probably getting his daughter ready for school, making breakfast in a kitchen that bore no resemblance to her designer space, with its marble countertops and appliances that cost more than most people's cars. The thought of his daughter Emma, he had said her name was Emma, sent an unexpected pang through her chest. 9 years old, believing her father was simply working hard to provide for them, unaware that the man tucking her into bed each night had once commanded respect in boardrooms and designed systems that kept aircraft safely in the sky. What kind of strength did it take to smile every morning and pretend that emptying trash cans was fulfilling work when you had once built something extraordinary? Selene's reflection stared back at her from the window, superimposed over the cityscape like a ghost haunting her own life. She looked polished even at 7 in the morning. Her silk robe perfectly draped her hair, falling in glossy waves over her shoulders, her skin bearing the healthy glow that came from expensive treatments and careful genetics. But beneath the surface perfection, she could see the cracks that had been forming for months. The tension around her eyes, the subtle tightness in her jaw, the way she held herself, as if she were perpetually braced for impact. Tonight, everything would change. In 12 hours, she would either retain control of Veyra Industries or watch it slip away into the hands of men who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to their vision of proper leadership. And she would face that moment not alone, but with a man whose presence in her life felt like both salvation and madness. Her phone buzzed against the marble countertop, and Margaret's name appeared on the screen. Selene answered without her usual business greeting, her mind still tangled in thoughts of dark eyes and gentle words. "Good morning, Margaret." "Good morning, Selene. I have your final schedule for today, and there are a few items that need your attention before tonight." Margaret's voice carried the crisp efficiency that had made her invaluable over the past 5 years. But there was something else there, a note of concern that she rarely allowed to surface. "Also, I wanted to confirm the seating arrangement for this evening. Should I expect you'll be attending alone, or—" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret knew better than anyone how isolated Selene's life had become, how the demands of leadership had gradually stripped away every personal connection until work became both sanctuary and prison. The idea that her CEO might actually have someone to bring to the gala was so foreign to their established routine that Margaret couldn't quite figure out how to ask. "Actually," Selene said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded, "I'll be bringing someone. Could you arrange for an additional place setting at the head table?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Selene wondered if the call had dropped. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice carried a carefully controlled curiosity that spoke volumes about how unexpected this development was. "Of course. May I ask the name for the seating chart?" "Adrian Cole." Another pause, shorter this time, but weighted with questions that Margaret was too professional to ask. "I'll take care of it immediately. Should I brief him on the evening's protocol, or would you prefer to handle that yourself?" The concern was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret had been with Selene long enough to know that her boss didn't make spontaneous decisions about her personal life and the sudden appearance of a mysterious +1. 12 hours before the most important event of her career raised obvious questions about judgment and timing. "I'll handle it," Selene said. "Margaret, I know this seems sudden, but—" "Selene," Margaret interrupted gently, "you don't owe me an explanation. You've been carrying the weight of this company alone for 3 years. If you've found someone who makes that burden lighter, then I'm happy for you. I just want to make sure you have everything you need to succeed tonight." The unexpected warmth in her assistant's voice brought tears to Selene's eyes. Margaret had watched her transform from a confident young executive into someone who lived and breathed corporate strategy, who worked 18-hour days and forgot to eat lunch, who smiled for cameras and shook hands at networking events while slowly disappearing beneath the weight of expectations and responsibility. If anyone understood how desperately Selene needed something real in her life, it was the woman who managed her calendar and knew exactly how many evenings she spent alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home. "Thank you," Selene whispered, "for everything. For these 5 years, for believing in me when—" "Save the sentimentality for tonight," Margaret said with affectionate briskness. "You have a company to save and a man to impress. Now about your schedule." They spent the next 20 minutes reviewing the day's obligations, final meetings with the financial team, a conference call with international partners, last-minute adjustments to her presentation. Normal business, the kind of detailed coordination that had filled Celine's days for years. But underneath the familiar rhythm of corporate efficiency, she felt something new humming in her chest. Anticipation maybe, or terror. Possibly both. After ending the call, she moved through her morning routine with unusual awareness of each small ritual. The shower that had become her daily meditation space where she planned strategies and rehearsed difficult conversations. The careful application of makeup that served as armor against a world that scrutinized every aspect of her appearance. The selection of clothing that would project exactly the right combination of authority and approachability. But today, as she stood before her walk-in closet with its rows of perfectly organized suits and dresses, she found herself thinking not about board members and shareholders, but about a man who had seen through her professional facade to the woman beneath. What would Adrian think when he saw her tonight? Would he recognize the person who had stood vulnerable and trembling in a corporate washroom, or would the polished exterior make her seem like a stranger? Her fingers traced over a midnight blue gown that hung near the back of the closet, a piece she had purchased for last year's gala, but never worn, deeming it too romantic for a CEO who needed to project strength above all else. The silk was the color of deep water, cut in clean lines that would skim her body without revealing too much, elegant enough for the most formal occasion, but somehow warmer than her usual choices. Before she could second-guess the decision, she pulled it from the rack and laid it across her bed. Tonight, she would be someone different. Not just Selene Veyra, CEO and corporate warrior, but Selene Veyra, woman. Someone worthy of standing beside a man who had offered her something no business acquisition or profit margin could provide the chance to be seen and accepted for exactly who she was. The day passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls, each one feeling strangely surreal, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. She sat through presentations and reviewed financial projections, nodded at appropriate moments, and asked the right questions. But part of her attention remained focused on the clock ticking toward evening, toward the moment when everything would change. At 4 o'clock, she found herself standing in her office bathroom, again staring at the same mirror where everything had begun. But this time, instead of seeing defeat in her reflection, she saw possibility. The woman looking back at her had color in her cheeks and light in her eyes that hadn't been there in months. The prospect of walking into the gala with Adrian beside her had awakened something she had thought was permanently dormant, the part of her that still believed in magic, in the possibility that two broken people could somehow make each other whole. Her phone rang and she answered absently, expecting Margaret or one of the department heads with last-minute updates. "Ms. Veyra." The voice was hesitant, unfamiliar. "Yes. This is Adrian. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Her heart did something complicated in her chest, a flutter that was part nervousness and part pure joy at hearing his voice. "Adrian, no, you're not interrupting. I was just..." She paused, realizing she had been thinking about him. "How did you get this number?" "I asked the security desk for your office line. I hope that's okay. I wanted to confirm that that you still want me to." The uncertainty in his voice touched something deep in her chest. Here was a man who had offered to risk everything to help her, and he was worried that she might have changed her mind in the harsh light of day, that she might have decided that a fallen engineer wasn't suitable company for a CEO at the most important event of her career. "Adrian?" she said softly. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No," he said immediately, then paused. "Maybe. I spent most of the night lying awake thinking about what we're about to do, and I keep coming back to the same question. Which is, what if I make things worse for you? What if people take one look at us together and see right through whatever we're trying to accomplish? What if my presence beside you becomes the thing that destroys your credibility rather than strengthening it?" Selene closed her eyes, hearing the genuine concern in his voice. He wasn't worried about his own reputation or comfort. He was worried about hers. In a world where everyone seemed to have an agenda, where every conversation carried the potential for calculation and manipulation, Adrian's selfless concern felt like a gift she didn't deserve. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "This morning my assistant asked me about my plans for tonight, and when I told her I was bringing someone, there was surprise in her voice. Not the good kind of surprise, the kind that made it clear how unusual it is for me to have anyone in my life who matters enough to include in something important. Selene, let me finish, she said gently. 5 years, Adrian. 5 years Margaret has been managing my schedule, coordinating my professional life, watching me work myself into the ground. And in all that time, there has never been a +1. Never been someone who cared enough about my success to want to stand beside me when it mattered. Never been. She took a shaky breath. Never been someone who looked at me and saw a woman worth protecting. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with understanding. When Adrian spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. Emma asked me this morning why I was ironing my shirt so carefully. I told her I had something important to do tonight, something that might help a good person who was in trouble. She said, "Daddy, are you going to be someone's hero?" And I realized. He paused, and she could hear him struggling with words. I realized that maybe that's exactly what I'm trying to be. Not because you need saving, but because everyone deserves to have someone in their corner when the fight matters most. Tears blurred Selene's vision, but this time they felt warm instead of bitter. Your daughter sounds wise. She gets that from her mother, Adrian said quietly, and there was a note of old pain in his voice that made Selene's chest tighten. The good parts of her mother anyway. Adrian, about tonight, we should probably coordinate our stories. If people ask how we met, how long we've been together, I've been thinking about that, he said. What if we don't overthink it? What if we just tell them that we met through work, that we've been seeing each other for a few months? Keep it simple. Keep it close to the truth. And if they ask about your background, I'll tell them I work in building maintenance for Veyra Industries. It's not a lie, I do work in building maintenance. And if they assume that means something more impressive than custodial services, well, she could hear the smile in his voice. Sometimes people see what they expect to see. The cleverness of it impressed her. Adrian understood that in her world, people made assumptions based on context and appearance. A well-dressed man accompanying the CEO to a formal event would automatically be assumed to hold a position of some importance. The truth was there for anyone who cared to look closely, but most people wouldn't bother to look beyond the surface. You're more devious than I gave you credit for, she said with genuine admiration. 3 years of watching corporate politics from the cleaning closet teaches a man about the power of strategic omission, Adrian replied. I may empty trash cans for a living, but I still remember how to navigate the waters you swim in every day. The reminder of his past life sent another pang through her chest. How many other hidden depths did this man possess? How many other pieces of himself had he been forced to set aside in order to survive the destruction of everything he had built? Adrian, can I ask you something personal? After last night, I think we're past the point of formal boundaries. Your wife, your ex-wife. When she left, when she took your business partner, Selene struggled to find words that wouldn't reopen old wounds. How did you survive it? How did you keep going when everything you had worked for was gone? Adrian was quiet for so long that she wondered if she had pushed too far. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that spoke of grief processed and accepted, but never forgotten. The first few weeks, I didn't think I would survive it. Not the financial destruction that was devastating but manageable. The betrayal was what nearly broke me. Finding out that the two people I trusted most in the world had been planning behind my back for months, that every conversation I'd had with either of them during that time had been a performance. He paused, and she could hear him taking a careful breath. There were nights when Emma was asleep that I would sit in our apartment and wonder if she would be better off without me. If maybe the kindest thing I could do was just disappear. But you didn't. No, because one morning she crawled into bed with me and asked if I was sad. And I realized that she was watching me, learning from me about how to handle it when life knocks you down. I couldn't teach her that giving up was an option. So I got up, put on a shirt that didn't smell like despair, and went out to find whatever work I could get. And every day after that, I got up again. The simple courage in his words took her breath away. Selene had faced her own share of professional setbacks and personal disappointments, but she had never experienced the kind of complete destruction that Adrian had survived. The loss of love, trust, financial security, and professional identity all at once would have crushed most people. The fact that he had not only survived, but had managed to maintain his humanity, his capacity for kindness and connection, spoke to a strength she was only beginning to understand. "I'm sorry," she said, inadequately, "for what they did to you, for what you lost." "Don't be sorry," Adrian said gently. "If none of that had happened, I wouldn't be here right now talking to you. I wouldn't have been in that building last night when you needed someone to see you clearly. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are also the things that put us exactly where we need to be." The philosophical acceptance in his voice made her chest tight with admiration, and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to the kind of feeling that could change everything. She had built her adult life around the premise that emotional attachments were weaknesses, that caring too much about anyone or anything made you vulnerable to the kind of destruction that Adrian had experienced. But sitting here listening to him speak about surviving betrayal and finding meaning in suffering, she wondered if maybe she had been wrong about what real strength looked like. "Selene," Adrian said softly, "are you nervous about tonight?" The question was simple, but it carried layers of meaning that went far beyond the evening's events. Was she nervous about the gala, about the board's decision, about standing beside him in front of 600 people and pretending to be someone who deserved love, about the possibility that pretending might become something more real than either of them was prepared for? "Terrified," she admitted. "Good," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "That means it matters, and things that matter are always worth being afraid of." "Adrian, yeah. Tonight, when we're in there together, I need you to know that whatever happens, whatever the board decides, having you beside me will be the most real thing in that room." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion that neither of them was quite ready to name. When Adrian spoke again, his voice was soft and warm and full of promise. 7 o'clock, Selene. I'll be there." After ending the call, Selene sat in her office chair and stared out at the city spread below her. Somewhere in that urban landscape, a man was preparing to risk everything he had rebuilt for himself and his daughter, in order to stand beside a woman he barely knew. The magnitude of that gesture, the trust it implied, and the courage it required overwhelmed her in ways that no business achievement ever had. She spent the remaining hours of the afternoon in a state of focused calm that surprised her. Instead of the usual pre-event anxiety that made her pace and second-guess every decision, she felt centered in a way that was entirely foreign to her experience. When Margaret knocked on her door at 5:30 to remind her that she needed to leave soon to prepare for the evening, Selene realized that for the first time in months, she was genuinely looking forward to what lay ahead. The drive home passed in a blur of city lights and gathering dusk. Her penthouse felt different when she walked through the door, not like the sterile sanctuary she had created to insulate herself from the world, but like a place where a woman who was worthy of love might prepare for an evening that could change everything. As she slipped into the midnight blue gown, Selene caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The dress transformed her from a corporate executive into something softer, more human. The silk moved with her body like water, the deep blue bringing out the green in her eyes and making her skin seem to glow from within. She looked like someone who might be loved by a good man, someone who might deserve the kind of loyalty and protection that Adrian was offering her. Her jewelry was simple pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother, and a delicate watch that was her one concession to sentimentality. No necklace, nothing that would distract from the clean lines of the dress or the vulnerable curve of her throat. She wanted to look elegant but not untouchable, sophisticated but not cold. The final touch was her hair, which she left loose around her shoulders instead of pulling it back into the severe chignon that had become her signature. The soft waves caught the light as she moved, making her look younger and infinitely more approachable than the boardroom warrior who had spent the day in meetings and conference calls. At 6:45, her phone buzzed with a text from the building's concierge. "Mr. Cole is here for you, Ms. Veyra." Selene's heart did something complicated in her chest as she gathered her clutch and wrap. This was it, the moment when fantasy became reality, when the desperate plan hatched in a sterile bathroom would either save her company or destroy what remained of her credibility. She walked to the elevator on legs that felt slightly unsteady. Her reflection multiplied endlessly in the mirrored walls as she descended toward the lobby and toward whatever waited for her there. The elevator doors opened, and Selene's breath caught in her throat. Adrian stood near the concierge desk, and the transformation was so complete that for a moment she wondered if she was looking at the wrong man. Gone was the custodial uniform and the careful invisibility that had made him blend into the background of her building. In its place was a man who commanded attention without demanding it, who wore a perfectly fitted tuxedo with the kind of natural elegance that couldn't be bought or taught. The formal wear revealed the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame, while the expert tailoring suggested resources and connections that seemed impossible for someone in his current circumstances. His dark hair was styled with subtle precision, and when he turned toward the elevator and their eyes met, Selene felt the world shift slightly on its axis. This was not a man pretending to belong in her world. This was a man who had once moved through circles even more exclusive than hers, who understood the unspoken rules and subtle hierarchies that govern the lives of the powerful. The Adrian Cole walking toward her, with a smile that made her knees weak, was not the fallen engineer she had discovered emptying trash cans, but the successful executive he had been before betrayal and loss had stripped away everything except his essential character. "You look..." Adrian stopped in front of her, his dark eyes moving over her face with an intensity that made her skin warm. "You look absolutely radiant." "You clean up fairly well yourself," Selene managed, though her voice came out slightly breathless. "The tuxedo is perfect. How did you..." "I called in a favor," Adrian said with a slight smile. "Turns out when you design aircraft guidance systems, you meet a lot of people who understand the importance of looking the part when circumstances require it." Marcus Denton. He was one of my clients before everything fell apart. He owns 3 tuxedo shops in the city now, and when I explained that I needed to look like someone worthy of standing beside the most beautiful woman in the room, he shrugged. Some friendships survive even the worst disasters. The casual way he called her beautiful sent heat spiraling through her chest, but it was the revelation about his network of connections that truly stunned her. Even in his reduced circumstances, Adrian had maintained relationships built on respect and genuine affection, rather than professional necessity. How many corporate executives could say the same? "Adrian," she said softly, "I need you to know something before we go in there tonight." "What's that?" "This isn't pretending anymore. Looking at you right now, knowing what you're risking for me." She took a shaky breath. "Whatever we're about to walk into, whatever happens in that ballroom, the way I feel about you isn't an act." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning the distance between 2 people who had been alone for far too long. Adrian's expression softened, and he reached out to trace his fingers along her cheek with infinite gentleness. "Selene," he said quietly, "it never was pretending. Not for me." The kiss that followed was soft and sweet and full of promise, a seal on an agreement that went far deeper than the evening's charade. When they finally broke apart, Selene felt transformed in ways that had nothing to do with the elegant gown or the carefully applied makeup. She felt like a woman who was worthy of love, standing beside a man who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. "Ready?" Adrian asked, offering her his arm with old-fashioned gallantry. Selene looked at him, this unexpected, impossible man who had walked into her life at exactly the moment when she needed him most, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Complete and absolute certainty. "Ready," she said, and meant it. The limousine glided through the city streets like a ship navigating calm waters, its interior filled with attention that had nothing to do with the evening's corporate implications, and everything to do with the electricity crackling between 2 people who had crossed an invisible line from which there was no return. Selene sat beside Adrian, hyper-aware of every point where their bodies almost touched his thigh, a whisper away from hers, his hand resting on the seat between them, close enough that she could feel its warmth. "Tell me about the key players," Adrian said quietly, his voice cutting through her nervous energy with the calm assurance of someone who understood that preparation was the best antidote to anxiety. The people I need to know, the dynamics I should watch for. Selene forced herself to focus on the business at hand, though every cell in her body seemed attuned to his presence beside her. Victor Doss will be the most dangerous. He's been CFO for 8 years and he's built his power base carefully. Charming when he needs to be ruthless when charm doesn't work. He'll smile at you tonight, probably compliment you on your obvious good taste in women, and all the while he'll be calculating exactly how to use your presence against me. How? Questions about your background, your qualifications, your intentions. He'll want to know if you're serious about me or just another in a series of diversions. The word left a bitter taste in her mouth. Victor believes that any man interested in me must be either a fortune hunter or someone looking to gain access to corporate secrets. The idea that someone might actually care about me as a person is foreign to his worldview. Adrian's hand moved to cover hers, his fingers intertwining with hers, in a gesture so natural that it felt like something they had been doing for years rather than hours. And what will you tell him when he asks, "That my personal life is none of his business," Selene said, then paused. But that won't stop him. Victor doesn't believe in boundaries when it comes to getting what he wants. What does he want? Control of the company. He's convinced the board that I'm too young, too impulsive, She gestured at herself with her free hand. Too female to handle the pressures of leadership. Tonight's vote isn't just about confidence in my abilities. It's about whether they believe a woman can run a Fortune 500 company without making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here she was risking everything on a plan born of desperation and executed with a man she had known for less than 24 hours. If that wasn't decision-making based on emotion rather than logic, she wasn't sure what would qualify. The other board members. Mixed bag. Harrison Wild has been with the company since my father's time, and he's genuinely fond of me. But he's old school. He wants what's best for the company, and if Victor can convince him that means new leadership. She shrugged. Patricia Summers is brilliant and fair, but she's also practical. She won't let sentiment cloud her judgment. Michael Torres is ambitious and tends to side with whoever he thinks will advance his own interests. The rest are largely followers. They'll go with whichever way the wind seems to be blowing. And your allies. James Morrison, my head of international development, but he's not on the board. Margaret, obviously, but she doesn't get a vote. Sarah Chen from legal, but again, no voting power. Selene's voice grew quieter. The truth is, Adrian, I'm walking into that room tonight largely alone, which is why... She squeezed his hand. Why what you're doing for me means more than I know how to express. The limousine began to slow as they approached the Meridian Ballroom, and through the tinted windows, Selene could see the gathering crowd of photographers and society reporters who covered the city's most exclusive events. The annual Veyra Industries Gala was always a spectacle, but tonight felt different. Tonight she could sense the anticipation in the air, the collective awareness that something significant was about to unfold. Showtime, Adrian murmured, and she felt, rather than saw him straighten beside her, transforming from the gentle man who had been holding her hand into someone who looked entirely comfortable with the prospect of walking into a room full of billionaires and power brokers. The car door opened and Adrian stepped out first, turning to offer Selene his hand with the kind of practiced gallantry that spoke of years spent in similar situations. As she emerged from the limousine, the camera flashes began in earnest, and she heard the familiar murmur of speculation that always accompanied her public appearances. But tonight, the murmur carried a different quality, surprise, curiosity, and something that might have been approval. "Ms. Veyra, who is your companion tonight," called out one of the reporters, and Selene felt Adrian's hand tighten slightly on hers. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, with the smooth professionalism that had become second nature, "I'd like you to meet Adrian Cole." Adrian stepped forward with easy confidence, and Selene watched in amazement as he seemed to grow more commanding simply by acknowledging the attention. This was not a man intimidated by cameras or crowds. This was someone who understood that confidence was often indistinguishable from belonging. "Mr. Cole, how long have you and Ms. Veyra been together?" another reporter called out. "Long enough to know that I'm the luckiest man in the city tonight," Adrian replied with a smile that was both charming and deflecting, answering the question without actually providing any useful information. The response drew appreciative laughter from the crowd, and Selene felt a surge of admiration for his deft handling of the situation. They moved through the gauntlet of photographers and into the ballroom, and Selene's breath caught at the transformation that had taken place since the afternoon setup. The Meridian's grand ballroom had been converted into something that looked like a scene from a fairy tale crystal chandeliers, casting warm light over tables, draped in midnight blue silk centerpieces of white orchids and silver branches that caught the light like captured moonbeams, and a string quartet playing softly in one corner. But it was the people that truly commanded attention. 600 of the city's most powerful individuals filled the space, their conversations creating a sophisticated buzz that spoke of deals being made and alliances being formed over champagne and carefully orchestrated networking. Selene had attended dozens of similar events, but tonight she saw it all with fresh eyes through the perspective of someone who had something precious to lose and someone precious to protect. "Breathe," Adrian murmured near her ear, his voice so quiet that only she could hear it. "You belong here more than anyone else in this room." Before she could respond, they were approached by Harrison Wilde, the board member who had known her since childhood and who represented her best hope for maintaining at least some support among the old guard. "Selene, my dear," Harrison said warmly, though she could see the curious speculation in his eyes as they moved to Adrian. "You look absolutely radiant tonight, and this must be the mysterious gentleman who has managed to capture our CEO's attention." "Harrison, I'd like you to meet Adrian Cole," Selene said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "Adrian, this is Harrison Wilde, one of our most valued board members and an old family friend." Adrian extended his hand with exactly the right degree of respect and confidence. "Mr. Wilde, it's an honor. Selene speaks of you with tremendous affection and respect." "Does she indeed?" Harrison's handshake lingered slightly, the older man clearly taking Adrian's measure. "And what is it you do, Mr. Cole?" "I work in building systems and maintenance," Adrian replied smoothly, and Selene marveled at how he managed to make custodial work sound like engineering without actually lying. "I specialize in ensuring that complex operational environments function efficiently." It was, she realized, a perfect description of his actual job responsibilities, phrased in language that allowed Harrison to make whatever assumptions he chose. The older man nodded approvingly, clearly filing Adrian away in the category of respectable professional, without digging deeper into specifics. "Excellent, excellent," Harrison said. "We need more people who understand the importance of solid foundations and reliable systems. Tell me, what do you think of our Selene's leadership of the company?" The question was posed casually, but Selene felt her breath catch. This was exactly the kind of probe she had worried about, seemingly innocent inquiries that were actually attempts to gather intelligence about her personal life and its potential impact on her professional judgment. Adrian's response was immediate and delivered with quiet conviction. "I think anyone who spends time with Selene quickly realizes that her intelligence and dedication are matched only by her genuine care for the people who depend on her decisions. She carries the weight of tremendous responsibility with grace and determination, and she never forgets that behind every corporate decision are real people with real lives who will be affected by the outcome." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Selene watched Harrison's expression soften as he absorbed not just the words, but the obvious emotion behind them. This was not the calculated praise of someone seeking advantage. This was the honest assessment of someone who had observed her carefully and found her worthy of admiration. "Well said, young man," Harrison murmured, and when he looked at Selene again, there was something new in his eyes. A kind of paternal satisfaction, as if he were pleased to see her with someone who truly appreciated her value. "Well said indeed." As Harrison moved away to greet other guests, Selene felt a surge of gratitude so intense it was almost overwhelming. Adrian had not only handled the encounter perfectly, he had done so in a way that elevated her in Harrison's estimation rather than simply defending her. The subtle skill required for such navigation spoke to a level of social intelligence that went far beyond anything she had expected. "That was masterful," she said quietly as they moved toward their table. "That was honest," Adrian corrected gently. "The masterful part is just knowing when honesty serves your purposes." Before she could respond, they were intercepted by Patricia Summers, the brilliant board member, whose support could make or break the evening's outcome. Patricia's sharp eyes moved between Selene and Adrian with the kind of analytical intensity that had made her one of the most successful venture capitalists in the city. "Selene," Patricia said with her characteristic directness, "you've been keeping secrets." Patricia, meet Adrian Cole. Adrian Patricia Summers, who has the distinction of being both one of our smartest board members and one of the most direct people I've ever known. "Ms. Summers," Adrian said, offering his hand. "Selene has mentioned your reputation for cutting through nonsense to get to the heart of important matters. I admire that quality." Patricia's handshake was brief and businesslike, but her attention was entirely focused on Adrian as she clearly ran through some internal calculation. "And what's your take on tonight's proceedings, Mr. Cole? Surely Selene has mentioned that we're dealing with some internal turbulence." The question was more aggressive than Harrison's, probing a direct challenge designed to see how Adrian would handle pressure and whether he understood the stakes involved in the evening's events. Selene felt her muscles tense, but Adrian's response was calm and measured. "I think," Adrian said carefully, "that any organization is fortunate to have leadership that inspires the kind of loyalty and dedication I see in the people who work with Selene. Change for its own sake rarely improves anything, but change driven by genuine vision and principled decision-making can transform everything. The question isn't whether Selene is capable of leading. Anyone who has watched her work knows she is. The question is whether the board has the wisdom to recognize what they have in her." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, and Selene could see her reassessing Adrian with new interest. The response had been sophisticated and political without being obsequious, supportive of Selene without being dismissive of legitimate governance concerns. It was the kind of answer that demonstrated both understanding of corporate dynamics and genuine conviction about Selene's abilities. "Interesting perspective," Patricia murmured. "And how long have you been observing Selene's work?" "Long enough to know that her reputation for excellence is well-deserved," Adrian replied neatly, sidestepping the question of timeline while reinforcing his confidence in Selene's capabilities. As Patricia moved away, clearly satisfied with what she had learned, Selene realized that Adrian was not just surviving these encounters, he was excelling at them. The combination of natural intelligence, hard-won wisdom, and genuine affection for her was creating exactly the impression she had hoped for, that she was a woman worthy of love and support from someone of substance and character. They made their way through the crowd, and with each introduction, each carefully navigated conversation, Selene felt her confidence growing. Adrian's presence beside her was transformative in ways she hadn't anticipated. He didn't overshadow her or try to speak for her. Instead, he provided a kind of steady support that allowed her own natural charisma to shine more brightly. With him beside her, she felt less like she was fighting for survival, and more like she was sharing her vision for the company's future with people who might actually be willing to listen. The evening's formal program began with cocktails and networking, followed by dinner service that provided natural breaks in conversation. Selene found herself seated at the head table with Adrian beside her. Victor Doss across the table, and the other key board members arranged strategically around them. The seating was both an honor and a challenge. Everyone at the table was evaluating everyone else, and the dinner conversation would be as crucial as any formal presentation. Victor had been watching them throughout the cocktail hour, and Selene could see the calculation in his eyes as he observed how naturally Adrian seemed to fit into the social dynamics of the evening. This was clearly not what the CFO had expected, and the uncertainty was making him more aggressive in his probing. "So, Adrian," Victor said, as the first course was served, his voice carrying the kind of casual friendliness that didn't quite mask the predatory intelligence beneath. "Selene tells us you work in building systems. That must be fascinating work, so much responsibility for keeping everything running smoothly." "It has its rewards," Adrian replied easily, his attention seemingly focused on his meal, but Selene could sense his awareness of the subtext. "There's satisfaction in knowing that the work you do helps other people accomplish their goals without having to worry about whether the infrastructure will support them. Must be quite a change from your previous work," Victor continued, and Selene felt her pulse quicken. Somehow Victor had done research on Adrian's background, or at least enough to know that custodial work wasn't his original career path. "Most careers involve evolution," Adrian said calmly. "The skills that serve you in one context often prove valuable in unexpected ways when circumstances change." "Indeed," Victor said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I find it interesting how people adapt when life doesn't go according to plan. Take business partnerships, for example. Sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who end up disappointing you." The comment was clearly designed to probe for information about Adrian's past, while simultaneously suggesting that personal relationships were inherently unreliable, a not-so-subtle dig at Selene's judgment in bringing someone into her professional sphere. Selene felt anger flash through her, but before she could respond, Adrian's voice cut through the tension with quiet steel. "You're absolutely right," Adrian said, meeting Victor's gaze directly. "I've learned that betrayal often comes from the people closest to you, the ones who know exactly how to inflict the most damage because they understand your vulnerabilities. But I've also learned that surviving that kind of destruction teaches you to recognize genuine integrity when you encounter it. It makes you value people who choose loyalty and honesty, even when they could profit from deception." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Victor's smile faltered slightly as he realized that Adrian was not only unashamed of whatever failures Victor had discovered, but was using them to draw a pointed contrast between people who could be trusted and people who couldn't. The implication was clear. Adrian had learned from experience to distinguish between character and opportunity, and he had chosen to stand beside Selene because he recognized her worth, not because he sought to exploit her position. Patricia Summers, who had been listening to the exchange with obvious interest, leaned forward slightly. "That's a remarkably mature perspective, Adrian. Not everyone emerges from professional setbacks with their integrity intact." "Professional setbacks have a way of clarifying what matters," Adrian replied. "They strip away everything except the things you're not willing to compromise: your values, your love for the people who depend on you, your commitment to treating others with dignity, regardless of their position or power. In some ways, losing everything I had built professionally was the best education I ever received about what kind of person I wanted to be." The conversation around the table had grown quiet as the other board members absorbed this exchange. Selene realized that Adrian had not only defended himself and by extension her judgment in choosing him, but had done so in a way that highlighted values that any reasonable person would admire. He had turned Victor's attack into an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of character and wisdom that made him worthy of standing beside a CEO. Victor, clearly recognizing that his strategy had backfired, shifted tactics. Of course, personal growth is admirable, but I'm sure you understand that in Selene's position, every relationship comes with certain considerations. The appearance of impropriety, questions about motives, concerns about whether emotional attachments might cloud professional judgment. The attack was more direct now, suggesting that Selene's relationship with Adrian represented a liability rather than an asset. Selene felt her temper rise, but again Adrian responded before she could speak. "Victor," Adrian said, and his use of the CFO's first name carried just enough familiarity to suggest equality rather than deference. "I appreciate your concern for Selene's reputation and the company's interests, but I think you're operating from a false premise, which is that caring about someone makes you weaker rather than stronger, that having someone in your life who believes in you unconditionally is a distraction rather than a source of strength." Adrian's voice grew warmer as he continued, his gaze moving to Selene with unmistakable affection. "I've watched Selene work. I've seen the hours she puts in, the care she takes with every decision, the way she considers not just profit margins, but the impact of corporate choices on real people's lives. Having someone who supports that dedication doesn't make her judgment questionable. It makes her more effective because she knows she has a foundation of personal happiness that can't be shaken by professional challenges. The words sent warmth spreading through Selene's chest, but it was the way Adrian was looking at her that made her breath catch. There was something in his eyes that went beyond the evening's performance, beyond the careful navigation of corporate politics. There was genuine tenderness, the kind of emotion that couldn't be manufactured or performed. Harrison Wilde, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, cleared his throat gently. I have to say it's refreshing to see Selene with someone who clearly appreciates her for the right reasons. Too often, powerful women find themselves surrounded by people who are attracted to their success rather than their character. Selene's success is impressive, Adrian agreed, but her character is extraordinary. The success flows from the character, not the other way around. The simple statement carried more impact than a dozen elaborate compliments. Around the table, Selene could see board members reassessing not just Adrian, but their perceptions of her. The man beside her was articulate, thoughtful, and clearly devoted to her well-being in ways that had nothing to do with corporate advantage. His presence suggested that she was someone worthy of love and protection, someone whose personal life reflected the same good judgment they hoped to see in her professional decisions. As the dinner courses continued, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Selene could feel the change in the room's dynamics. The board members were relating to her differently, not as a young woman trying to prove she belonged in a man's world, but as an accomplished leader who had found someone worthy of sharing her life. Adrian's presence had subtly but definitively changed how they saw her, and by extension, how they evaluated her fitness for leadership. During a brief lull in conversation, Adrian leaned close to her ear and whispered, "How are we doing?" The question sent shivers down her spine, partly because of his proximity, and partly because of the way he said "we," as if they were truly partners in this endeavor, as if her success was something he was personally invested in achieving. "Better than I dared hope," she whispered back, and felt his smile against her ear. "Good," he murmured. "Because in about 10 minutes you're going to get up and give the most important speech of your career, and I want you to know that everyone at this table is already convinced you deserve to be exactly where you are." The formal program began with welcoming remarks from Harrison Wilde, followed by a brief presentation of the company's annual achievements. Selene sat through the preliminary speeches with growing anticipation, knowing that her moment was approaching. But instead of the familiar anxiety that usually preceded her public speaking, she felt centered and confident in ways that seemed impossible given the circumstances. When Harrison introduced her, Selene rose to sustained applause and moved to the podium with Adrian's encouragement still warm in her ears. As she looked out over the assembled crowd, board members and shareholders, employees and partners, competitors and allies, she felt a moment of perfect clarity about what she needed to say. 3 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics, when I accepted the responsibility of leading this company, I made a promise to honor the vision that my parents had for Veyra Industries. Not just their vision for profits and growth, but their vision for what a corporation could be when it refused to choose between success and integrity. She spoke about the company's achievements, the challenges they had faced, and overcome the opportunities that lay ahead. But more than that, she spoke about values, about the responsibility that came with power, about the importance of making decisions that served not just shareholders, but all the stakeholders whose lives were touched by corporate choices. As she reached the conclusion of her remarks, Selene's gaze found Adrian in the audience, and the pride and admiration in his eyes gave her the courage to speak from her heart in ways she had never dared in a professional setting. "Leadership isn't about having all the answers," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It's about surrounding yourself with people who challenge you to be better, who support your vision, while keeping you grounded in reality, who remind you that behind every spreadsheet and profit projection are real people whose lives matter. It's about building not just a successful company, but a company that succeeds in ways that make the world a little bit better." The applause that followed was longer and more enthusiastic than any she had received before. And as she made her way back to her seat, Selene felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the evening's outcome. She had spoken her truth, defended her vision, and done so with the support of someone who believed in her completely. But even as she settled back into her chair beside Adrian, she could see Victor Doss rising from his seat with the kind of predatory smile that meant the real battle was just beginning. "Thank you, Selene, for those inspiring remarks," Victor said as he took the podium. "I think we can all agree that passion and idealism are admirable qualities in a leader. The question we face tonight is whether those qualities, however well-intentioned, are sufficient to guide a company through the complex challenges of an increasingly competitive marketplace." And with that, Victor began his carefully orchestrated assault on everything Selene had built, every decision she had made, every vision she had articulated. The attack was sophisticated and thorough, designed to plant seeds of doubt about her experience, her judgment, and her ability to prioritize corporate interests over personal considerations. As Victor spoke, building his case for new leadership with surgical precision, Selene felt Adrian's hand find hers beneath the table. His fingers intertwined with hers, steady and warm and completely unshakable, reminding her that whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. The real fight was just beginning, but for the first time in her career, Selene Veyra had someone in her corner who was fighting for her rather than simply fighting beside her, and that she realized might make all the difference between survival and victory. Victor's voice carried through the ballroom with the practiced cadence of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, each word carefully chosen to plant doubt while maintaining the veneer of respectful concern. He spoke of market volatility and competitive pressures, of the need for seasoned leadership in uncertain times, of the board's fiduciary responsibility to consider all options for the company's future. But beneath the corporate jargon, his message was clear. Selene Veyra was too young, too inexperienced, and too emotionally compromised to lead them through the challenges ahead. The Hartwell acquisition, Victor said, his voice taking on a tone of regretful necessity, resulted in a $43 million loss that could have been avoided with more experienced oversight. The European expansion initiative, while ambitious, failed to account for regulatory complexities that a more seasoned executive would have anticipated. These are not failures of character, they are failures of judgment that we simply cannot afford to repeat. Selene felt each criticism like a physical blow, not because the facts were wrong, but because Victor was presenting them without context, without acknowledgement of the market conditions that had made those outcomes inevitable, without recognition of the lessons learned and the systems put in place to prevent similar missteps. He was painting a picture of reckless leadership that bore little resemblance to the careful, thoughtful approach she had actually taken. But it was Victor's next line of attack that made her blood run cold. Of course, we must also consider whether personal entanglements might be affecting our CEO's professional judgment. Victor continued, his gaze moving meaningfully to where Selene sat beside Adrian. It's natural for a young woman in a position of tremendous responsibility to seek companionship and support. The question is whether such relationships enhance or compromise her ability to make the difficult decisions that leadership requires. The implication hung in the air like poison gas, and Selene felt the room's attention shift to her and Adrian with renewed scrutiny. This was exactly what she had feared, that her presence with Adrian would be used as evidence of poor judgment, that her personal choices would be weaponized against her professional competence. "For instance," Victor said, and Selene's heart began to race with dread, "one might question the wisdom of bringing a romantic partner to such an important corporate event, particularly when that partner's own professional background raises certain concerns." The pause was deliberate, theatrical, designed to build suspense, while Victor savored the moment before delivering what was clearly his coup de grace. Selene felt Adrian's hand tighten around hers, but she could sense his tension despite his outward calm. "Adrian Cole," Victor said, and his voice carried the satisfaction of someone playing a trump card, "is indeed an employee of Veyra Industries, as he mentioned earlier. But perhaps Mr. Cole was being modest about his specific role. He doesn't work in building systems management as one might have assumed from his earlier comments. He works in custodial services. He's a janitor." The silence that followed was deafening. Selene felt the weight of 600 pairs of eyes turning toward their table, felt the shock ripple through the crowd like a physical force. Board members stared, shareholders whispered, and she could see the calculation beginning in dozens of faces as people reassessed everything they had observed about her and Adrian throughout the evening. Now, there's nothing shameful about honest work, Victor continued with false magnanimity. But one has to question the judgment of a CEO who would bring custodial staff as her date to the company's most important annual event. What does this say about her understanding of appropriate professional boundaries? What does it suggest about her ability to maintain the kind of dignified corporate image that our shareholders expect? The attack was devastating in its simplicity. Victor had taken the truth that Adrian worked as a janitor and weaponized it without technically lying about anything. He had made it seem as though Selene had deliberately misled the board about Adrian's position, that she had poor judgment in mixing her personal and professional lives, and that her relationship choices reflected badly on her fitness for leadership. Selene felt the fragile confidence she had built throughout the evening crumbling around her. This was her worst nightmare, made real not just the exposure of Adrian's current circumstances, but the way that exposure was being used to paint her as someone who lacked the basic judgment required for corporate leadership. She could see doubt creeping into the faces of board members who had seemed supportive just moments before, could feel the shift in the room's energy as people began to question everything they thought they knew about her. Beside her, Adrian sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. She wondered if he was regretting his decision to help her, if he was calculating the cost of being publicly humiliated in front of the city's most powerful people. She wanted to apologize to somehow shield him from the fallout of Victor's attack, but she couldn't find words that seemed adequate to the moment. Then Adrian stood up. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, and it commanded immediate attention from everyone in the ballroom. He didn't look angry or defensive. Instead, he looked like a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, who had prepared for this attack, and was ready to meet it head-on. "Mr. Doss," Adrian said, his voice carrying easily through the sound system as he spoke without moving toward the podium. "Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify my position for everyone here tonight." Victor's confident smile faltered slightly, clearly not having expected Adrian to respond directly to the attack. "Of course, Mr. Cole. Please enlighten us. You're absolutely right that I work in custodial services for Veyra Industries," Adrian said, his tone conversational but somehow commanding. "For the past 8 months, I've been responsible for maintaining the 47th floor of the headquarters building. I empty trash cans, clean windows, vacuum carpets, and ensure that the executive offices remain spotless and functional." The admission should have been humiliating, but something in Adrian's delivery transformed it into something else entirely. He spoke without shame or defensiveness, as if he were simply providing factual information that any reasonable person would find interesting rather than scandalous. "What Mr. Doss didn't mention," Adrian continued, "is that this custodial position represents the latest chapter in a career that began 15 years ago when I founded Cole Aerospace Systems, a company that developed guidance technologies for commercial aircraft. We held 12 patents, employed 47 people, and our systems are currently installed in aircraft that safely transport millions of passengers every year." A murmur rippled through the crowd as people began to reassess their assumptions. This was not the story they had expected to hear from someone Victor had dismissed as merely a janitor. 3 years ago, my business partner and my wife decided that my life's work would be more valuable in their hands than in mine. Through a combination of legal maneuvering and personal betrayal, they succeeded in taking everything I had built, my company, my patents, my financial security, everything except my 9-year-old daughter and my determination to provide for her in whatever way circumstances allowed. Adrian's voice remained steady, but Selene could hear the emotion underlying his words. Not bitterness, but a kind of hard-won wisdom that came from surviving complete destruction and choosing to keep moving forward. "So yes, Mr. Doss, I clean offices for a living. I do it because my daughter needs food and shelter and stability, and because honest work, any honest work, is preferable to dishonest alternatives. I do it because I learned that a man's worth isn't measured by his job title or his bank account, but by his character and his commitment to the people who depend on him." The ballroom was completely silent now, every person hanging on Adrian's words. Selene felt tears stinging her eyes as she listened to him lay bare the most painful chapters of his life in order to defend her judgment and their relationship. "But here's what I think Mr. Doss really wants you to consider," Adrian said, his gaze moving to Victor with quiet intensity. "He wants you to believe that because I work in custodial services, I'm somehow unworthy of Selene's attention. That my presence here tonight reflects poorly on her judgment. That a CEO should only associate with people who meet certain standards of professional success and social standing." Adrian paused, letting the implications settle over the crowd before continuing. "I've spent 8 months observing life on the 47th floor. I've watched executives come and go, seen deals made and broken, witnessed the daily machinery of corporate power from a perspective that most people in this room will never experience. And I can tell you without hesitation that job titles and corner offices tell you nothing about a person's character or their capacity for leadership." He turned slightly to look at Selene, and the expression on his face was so full of admiration and affection that several people in the audience visibly softened. "I've watched Selene Veyra work 18-hour days not because she had to, but because she cared too much about getting things right to accept anything less than excellence. I've seen her take phone calls at midnight from employees facing personal crises, offering not just professional support, but genuine human compassion. I've watched her make decisions that prioritized long-term stability over short-term profits, even when those choices weren't popular with people who were more interested in quarterly returns than sustainable growth." His voice grew stronger as he continued, and Selene realized that this wasn't just a defense of their relationship. It was a passionate testimony to her character from someone who had observed her more closely than perhaps anyone else in her professional life. "You want to know about judgment, Mr. Doss. Selene's judgment is what kept this company profitable during the worst economic downturn in a decade. Her judgment is what led to the innovations that have put Veyra Industries ahead of our competitors in 3 major markets. Her judgment is what attracts and retains the kind of talented people who could work anywhere but choose to work here because they believe in her vision." Adrian's gaze swept across the room, taking in board members and shareholders with equal intensity. "As for my worthiness to stand beside her, that's not for me to judge, but I can tell you that I would rather be a janitor who loves an extraordinary woman than a CEO who lacks the character to recognize excellence when he sees it." The final statement hung in the air like a challenge, and Selene saw several board members exchange meaningful glances. Adrian had not only defended himself and their relationship, but had turned Victor's attack into an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of integrity and wisdom that made him worthy of standing beside a leader. Victor, clearly realizing that his strategy had backfired spectacularly, attempted to regain control of the narrative. "Well, that's certainly a touching story, Mr. Cole, but personal redemption narratives don't address the fundamental question of whether such Victor." The voice belonged to Patricia Summers, who had risen from her seat with the kind of authority that immediately commanded attention. "I think we've heard enough." The venture capitalist moved to the front of the room with purposeful strides, her expression carrying the no-nonsense intensity that had made her one of the most respected investors in the city. "In 30 years of evaluating leadership potential," Patricia said, her voice cutting through the ballroom with surgical precision, "I've learned that character reveals itself most clearly under pressure. Tonight we've witnessed character from multiple perspectives." She gestured toward Victor with barely concealed disdain. "We've seen the character of someone who believes that destroying personal relationships and humiliating good people serves the interests of corporate governance. Someone who thinks that a person's current job title is more important than their integrity, their loyalty, or their capacity for growth." Victor's face had gone pale clearly, realizing that his carefully orchestrated attack was collapsing around him. "We've also seen," Patricia continued, turning toward Adrian and Selene, "the character of a man who has survived devastating personal and professional losses without becoming bitter or dishonest. A man who chose to rebuild his life through honest work rather than taking shortcuts or seeking revenge. A man who stands beside someone he cares about, even when that choice exposes him to exactly the kind of judgment and humiliation we've witnessed tonight." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering her conclusion. And we've seen the character of a CEO who inspires that kind of loyalty and protection from someone who has every reason to be cynical about trust and partnership. Someone whose personal choices reflect the same integrity and wisdom that she brings to her professional responsibilities. Patricia's gaze moved across the assembled board members and shareholders, her authority lending weight to every word. If this board chooses to remove Selene Veyra from leadership because she's found someone worthy of her love and respect, then we deserve whatever mediocrity follows. If we can't recognize that the kind of person who would risk everything to support someone else's success is exactly the kind of person we should want in our CEO's life, then we've lost sight of what makes companies truly successful. The applause that followed Patricia's statement started slowly but built quickly, spreading through the ballroom like wildfire until nearly everyone was standing and clapping. Selene felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched her colleagues and peers rise to their feet in support not just of her leadership, but of her choices and her worth as a human being. Harrison Wilde was the next to stand, his aged voice carrying the weight of decades in corporate leadership. I move that we take a formal vote of confidence in Selene Veyra's continued leadership of this company. All in favor. The response was overwhelming. Hand after hand rose throughout the ballroom, board members and shareholders alike, demonstrating their support with visible enthusiasm. When the votes were counted, the margin wasn't even close. Selene had retained her position with the strongest mandate she had ever received. As the formal proceedings concluded and people began to move toward the reception area, Selene found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. But all she could focus on was Adrian, who stood beside her with quiet satisfaction, having just risked everything to defend her honor and their relationship. "I can't believe you did that," she whispered to him during a brief lull in the congratulations. "Did what?" Adrian asked with a smile that made her heart race. "Stood up in front of 600 people and told them you love me." "I didn't tell them I love you," Adrian said softly, stepping closer so that only she could hear his words. "I told them I would rather be a janitor who loves an extraordinary woman than a CEO who lacks character. The love part." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "The love part I'm telling you now." The words hit her like a physical force, stealing her breath and making her knees weak. She stared at him. This impossible man, who had walked into her life less than 24 hours ago, and turned everything upside down in the most beautiful way imaginable. "Adrian," she whispered. But before she could find words to express the depth of what she was feeling, they were interrupted by Victor Doss. The CFO approached with the expression of a man who had lost a battle but was not yet ready to concede the war. His face was flushed with embarrassment and anger, and when he spoke, his voice carried a venom that made several nearby guests step back. "Congratulations, Selene," Victor said with false cordiality. "You've managed to turn your poor judgment into a sympathy vote. I hope you're pleased with yourself." "Victor," Selene said calmly, "I think you've said enough for one evening." "Have I? Because I think there are still some things that need to be said." Victor's gaze moved to Adrian with open hostility. "Enjoy your Cinderella story while it lasts, Mr. Cole. But remember that fairy tales don't usually survive contact with reality. And reality is that you're a failed businessman who empties trash cans for a living while she's a CEO with responsibilities and pressures you couldn't possibly understand." The attack was personal and vicious, designed to plant seeds of doubt about the sustainability of their relationship, even in the aftermath of Victor's professional defeat. Selene felt anger flash through her, but before she could respond, Adrian's voice cut through the tension with quiet steel. "You're right about one thing, Victor," Adrian said, and there was something in his tone that made everyone within earshot turn their attention to the confrontation. "I probably don't understand all the pressures that come with Selene's position, but I understand enough about leadership to recognize the difference between someone who uses power to build things up and someone who uses it to tear things down." Adrian stepped closer to Victor, and despite the CFO's superior height and broader frame, there was something in Adrian's bearing that made him seem like the more formidable presence. "I understand enough about character to recognize the difference between someone who faces adversity with grace and someone who responds to defeat with spite. And I understand enough about love to know that it doesn't depend on job titles or bank accounts or social standing. It depends on seeing someone clearly and choosing them anyway every single day, regardless of what the world thinks about that choice. The words were delivered with quiet intensity, but they carried the weight of absolute conviction. Victor's face grew redder, but before he could respond, Adrian continued. So you're welcome to question whether I'm worthy of Selene's love, Victor. But I know something you don't. Adrian's smile was calm and completely confident. She's already answered that question for herself. With that, Adrian took Selene's hand and led her away from the confrontation, leaving Victor standing alone with his bitterness and defeat. As they moved through the crowd toward the exit, Selene felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the evening's professional victories and everything to do with the man walking beside her. They had survived Victor's attack. They had won the board's confidence. They had proven that love and professional success weren't mutually exclusive. But more than that, they had discovered something worth fighting for, not just individually, but together. The limousine ride back to Selene's building passed in comfortable silence, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Adrian's hand rested in hers, warm and steady, while the city lights blurred past the windows like falling stars. Everything had changed in the space of a few hours, and yet somehow it felt as though they had been moving toward this moment from the instant they first met in that sterile bathroom where everything began. I still can't believe you told 600 people that you love me, Selene said softly as they reached her building. I told 600 people that I would rather love you than be anyone else, Adrian corrected gently. There's a difference, which is, one is a declaration of feeling, the other is a declaration of choice. He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious in the dim light of the car. I'm choosing you, Selene, not because you're a CEO or because you're successful or because you can offer me anything that would change my circumstances. I'm choosing you because of who you are when everything else is stripped away. The woman who cries in bathroom mirrors when she thinks no one is watching, who works 18-hour days because she cares too much to accept anything less than excellence, who risks everything on the crazy idea that maybe she deserves to be loved. The words washed over her like a benediction, each one settling into the empty spaces in her heart that she had learned to ignore. For so long she had believed that love was something that came with conditions, that acceptance had to be earned through achievement and maintained through perfection. The idea that someone could see all her flaws and fears and failures and choose her anyway felt almost too good to be true. Adrian, she whispered, I'm scared. Of what? Of believing this is real. Of letting myself hope that maybe fairy tales can survive contact with reality after all. Adrian's smile was soft and infinitely tender. Then let's find out together. As they walked through the lobby of her building toward the elevator that would carry them to whatever came next, Selene realized that the most important battle of the evening hadn't been fought in the ballroom against Victor Doss and the board of directors. It had been fought in her own heart against the belief that she was destined to choose between professional success and personal happiness. Tonight, she had learned that she didn't have to choose. Tonight, she had discovered that the right person wouldn't ask her to be smaller or different or less than who she was. The right person would see her clearly and love her more, not less, for her ambition and strength and determination. Tonight, she had found someone worth fighting for, and someone who was willing to fight for her in return. The elevator doors closed behind them, carrying them toward a future that was suddenly bright with possibility, toward a love story that had begun with pretense, but had revealed itself to be the most authentic thing either of them had ever experienced. And as the floors passed by and they rose together toward whatever came next, Selene Veyra finally understood what it felt like to be truly, completely, unconditionally loved. The elevator's soft ascent to the 43rd floor felt like a journey through time itself, each passing second stretching into infinity, while simultaneously racing toward a future that neither of them could have imagined just 24 hours earlier. Selene stood beside Adrian in the mirrored space, watching their reflection multiply endlessly. a woman in midnight blue silk and a man in perfectly tailored formal wear. Both of them transformed by events that had begun with desperation and evolved into something that felt dangerously close to destiny. When the doors opened into her penthouse hallway, Selene's hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with her keys. The simple act of unlocking her door had never felt so weighted with significance, as if she were opening a gateway to an entirely different life, rather than simply returning home after an evening out. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked as they stepped inside, then immediately felt foolish for falling back on polite social conventions when everything between them had moved far beyond the realm of ordinary courtesy. Adrian smiled at her obvious nervousness, but there was nothing mocking in his expression, only gentle understanding of someone navigating uncharted emotional territory. "Coffee sounds perfect," he said, though they both knew that neither of them was thinking about caffeine. Her penthouse felt different with Adrian in it, as if his presence had somehow altered the very atmosphere of the space. The designer furniture and carefully curated art that had once felt like expressions of her success now seemed cold and impersonal compared to the warmth radiating from the man who stood near her floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city spread below them like a circuit board of dreams and ambitions. "This is quite a view," Adrian said quietly, and she could hear something in his voice that wasn't quite wonder, but wasn't entirely comfortable either. Selene paused in her coffee preparation, suddenly seeing her home through his eyes. The marble countertops that cost more than most people's annual salaries, the imported Italian fixtures, the artwork that represented investments rather than emotional connections, all of it spoke to a life of privilege and isolation that stood in stark contrast to the modest apartment where he was raising his daughter on a custodian's salary. "Adrian," she said softly, moving to stand beside him at the window. "I need you to know that none of this matters to me. Not the way you might think." "Doesn't it?" he asked. And there was no accusation in the question, only genuine curiosity. "This represents everything you've worked for, everything you've achieved. How can it not matter?" Selene looked out at the glittering cityscape, trying to find words for feelings she had never examined too closely. "When I was growing up, my parents worked 18-hour days building this company. They missed school plays and birthday parties and family dinners because they were convinced that success would somehow make up for all the missed moments. And maybe it did for them. They found meaning in building something that would outlast them." She turned to face him, and in the dim lighting of her living room, his dark eyes seemed to hold all the understanding in the world. "But I've been living in this penthouse for 3 years, and until tonight I never once brought someone here who mattered to me. I've eaten alone at this dining table, slept alone in that bedroom, stood at these windows and wondered if this was what my parents really wanted for me. All the trappings of success, with none of the human connections that make success meaningful." Adrian's expression softened, and he reached out to trace his fingers along her cheek with infinite gentleness. "And now I think maybe they just wanted me to be happy. And maybe they would have understood that happiness doesn't come from corner offices or stock portfolios or penthouses. Maybe they would have understood that it comes from having someone who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway." The words hung between them like a bridge, spanning the distance between two people who had been alone for far too long. Adrian's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and she leaned into the touch with a sigh that felt like something essential settling into place. "Selene," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." The seriousness in his voice made her breath catch. "What?" "When I agreed to help you tonight, I thought I was doing it for all the right reasons. To help someone who deserved better than she was getting, to teach my daughter about standing up for good people, to maybe find some meaning in circumstances that had left me feeling pretty worthless." He paused, his gaze searching her face with an intensity that made her heart race. But somewhere between the cocktail hour and Victor's attack, I realized I was lying to myself. I wasn't doing this to help you or to teach Emma or to find meaning. I was doing it because I was already falling in love with you, and the thought of watching you face that battle alone was unbearable. The confession hit her like a physical force, stealing her breath and making her knees weak. She had hoped, had dared to believe that what she was feeling might be reciprocated, but hearing the words spoken aloud with such quiet conviction overwhelmed her in ways she hadn't expected. "When?" she whispered. "When what? When did you know? When did you realize you were falling in love with me?" Adrian's smile was soft and infinitely tender. About 8 months ago, when I was cleaning your office late one night and found you asleep at your desk with financial reports spread around you like battle plans. You were wearing a wrinkled blouse and your hair was falling out of its clip and you looked exhausted and vulnerable and absolutely beautiful. I stood there for 10 minutes just watching you sleep, and I realized I wanted to protect you from whatever was making you work yourself to death. Tears blurred Selene's vision as she absorbed the magnitude of what he was saying. You've been in love with me for 8 months. I've been trying not to be in love with you for 8 months, Adrian corrected gently. There's a difference. Because loving you felt impossible, you were the CEO and I was the janitor. You lived in penthouses and I lived in 2-bedroom apartments. You made decisions that affected thousands of people while I emptied trash cans and tried to keep my daughter from knowing how far we'd fallen. He moved closer, and she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the faint scent of his cologne, mixed with something that was uniquely him. But tonight, when you asked me to pretend to love you for 10 minutes, I realized that pretending was the one thing I couldn't do. Because I already loved you more than I'd ever loved anyone, and standing beside you wasn't going to be acting, it was going to be the most honest thing I'd ever done. The words washed over her like a benediction, each one settling into places in her heart that had been empty for so long she had forgotten they existed. For years she had believed that love was something that came with conditions, that acceptance had to be earned through achievement and maintained through perfection. The idea that someone had been loving her quietly, patiently, without expectation or demand, felt almost too beautiful to be real. I love you too, she whispered, and the words felt like the first completely honest thing she had said in years. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you see the best in people, even when they can't see it in themselves. I love that you chose integrity over bitterness when life destroyed everything you'd built. I love that you would risk everything to help someone you barely knew because it was the right thing to do. Adrian's eyes were bright with emotion as he listened to her catalog the reasons for her feelings. But when she finished, he shook his head slightly. Those are all very good reasons to respect someone, Selene, but they're not why you love me. They're not... No, he said softly, stepping close enough that she could feel his breath against her cheek. You love me because when you look at me, you see someone who understands what it feels like to carry the weight of other people's expectations. Someone who knows what it costs to be responsible for other people's livelihoods and happiness. Someone who recognizes that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites, they're two sides of the same coin. His words hit her with the force of absolute truth, and she realized that he understood her in ways that went far deeper than admiration or attraction. He saw the lonely executive who worked 18-hour days because she cared too much to accept anything less than excellence. He saw the woman who cried in bathroom mirrors when she thought no one was watching. He saw the person who had built walls around her heart, not because she didn't want love, but because she was terrified of needing it. You love me, Adrian continued, his voice growing softer and more certain. Because I'm the first person who ever made you feel like you could be completely yourself, successful and scared, strong and vulnerable, powerful and human, without having to choose between those things. The accuracy of his assessment took her breath away. For so long, she had felt like she was living multiple lives, the corporate warrior who commanded boardrooms, the lonely woman who went home to an empty penthouse, the daughter trying to honor her parents' legacy while forging her own path. With Adrian, all those different versions of herself somehow cohered into a single integrated person who didn't have to apologize for her complexity. How do you do that? She asked wonderingly. Do what? See me so clearly. Understand things about me that I barely understand about myself. Adrian's smile was warm and infinitely loving. Because I've been watching you for 8 months, learning the patterns of your days and the rhythms of your heart. Because I've seen you when you thought no one was looking, when all your professional masks were set aside and you were just Selene, tired and determined and beautiful and human. He paused, his gaze moving over her face with tender intensity. And because I recognize the symptoms, I know what it looks like when someone is trying to carry more than they were meant to carry alone. I know what it sounds like when someone is succeeding by every external measure, but still feels empty inside. I know what it feels like to wonder if anyone could love the person you really are, rather than the person you think you should be. The understanding in his voice made tears spill over her cheeks, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, they felt cleansing rather than bitter. These were tears of recognition, of relief, of the overwhelming gratitude that came from being truly seen and accepted. "Adrian," she whispered, "what happens now?" "Now," he said, reaching up to brush away her tears with infinite gentleness. "We figure out what it looks like to build a life together. We figure out how to blend your world and mine, how to make room for Emma in whatever this becomes, how to navigate the practical realities of two people who started in very different places, but want to end up in the same one." The mention of his daughter brought a flutter of nervousness to Selene's chest. What if she doesn't like me? What if she thinks I'm trying to replace her mother or change her relationship with you? "Emma," Adrian said with quiet conviction, "is going to love you almost as much as I do, because she's been watching me be sad for 3 years, and she's smart enough to recognize when someone makes her father happy again." "But what if—" Selene, Adrian interrupted gently. "We don't have to solve every problem tonight. We don't have to figure out the next 20 years in the next 20 minutes. We just have to decide that what we found together is worth protecting, worth nurturing, worth the risk of trying to build something real." The simplicity of his proposal was both terrifying and liberating. For someone who had built her career on 5-year plans and strategic projections, the idea of moving forward based on love and hope rather than certainty and guarantees felt like stepping off a cliff. But as she looked into Adrian's eyes, she realized that some kinds of courage couldn't be planned or strategized. They could only be chosen moment by moment, day by day. "I want to try," she said, and the words felt like the bravest thing she had ever spoken. "I want to build something real with you, even if I don't know what that looks like yet." Adrian's smile was like sunrise after the longest night of her life. "Then that's enough. That's more than enough." The kiss that followed was different from the gentle, tentative connection they had shared in the lobby. This was deeper, more certain, full of promise and possibility, and the kind of passion that came from two people who had found something worth keeping. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Selene felt transformed in ways that had nothing to do with the elegant gown or the evening's corporate victories. "Stay," she said, and the word came out like a prayer. "Stay tonight. Stay tomorrow. Stay until we figure out what comes next." Adrian's answer was another kiss, slower and sweeter, that tasted like promises and felt like coming home. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, and his eyes were bright with emotion. "I love you, Selene Veyra," he said quietly. "Not because you're successful or powerful or beautiful, though you're all of those things. I love you because you asked me to pretend to love you for 10 minutes, and you made me realize that pretending was the one thing I couldn't do." "And I love you, Adrian Cole," she replied, "because you saw me clearly enough to know that what I really needed wasn't someone to pretend to love me, it was someone brave enough to love me for real." 3 months later, on a Saturday morning that smelled of pancakes and possibility, Selene woke up in a house that bore no resemblance to her sterile penthouse, but felt more like home than anywhere she had ever lived. The modest 2-story colonial in a quiet suburban neighborhood had been Adrian's choice, close enough to Emma's school that she could walk to classes, far enough from the corporate district that weekends felt genuinely separate from work. The sound of laughter drifted up from the kitchen, and Selene smiled as she recognized the voices, Adrian's deep rumble mixed with Emma's bright giggle, the two of them probably making the elaborate weekend breakfast that had become their tradition. She had moved in officially 2 weeks ago, but she had been spending most nights here for the past month, gradually integrating her life with theirs in ways that felt natural and right. Emma had accepted her presence with the easy adaptability of children, and their relationship had developed into something that surprised them both. The 9-year-old was curious about Selene's work, fascinated by the idea that a woman could run a company, and completely unimpressed by corporate hierarchies or executive privileges. To Emma, Selene was simply the woman who made her father smile again, who helped with homework and remembered to buy the specific brand of cereal that was currently acceptable, who listened to stories about school with genuine interest and offered advice without condescension. The transformation in Adrian had been even more remarkable. Away from the custodial uniform and the careful invisibility that had defined his working life, he had gradually reclaimed pieces of the man he had been before loss and betrayal had stripped away his confidence. Selene had quietly arranged for him to transition from custodial services to a consulting position with the company's facilities management division work that utilized his engineering background while allowing him to maintain his pride and independence. The position came with a salary that made their shared financial future stable and secure, but more importantly, it restored his sense of professional purpose. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Adrian said as Selene appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing one of his old MIT t-shirts and a pair of shorts that had never seen the inside of a boardroom. "Emma was beginning to think you'd move back to your penthouse." "Not a chance," Selene said, dropping a kiss on top of Emma's head before moving to where Adrian stood at the stove flipping pancakes with the focused attention he brought to everything he cared about. "Besides, someone promised me chocolate chip pancakes and I'm not leaving until I get them." "They're almost ready," Emma announced importantly. "Daddy let me help measure the chocolate chips and I only ate a few of them." "Just a few?" Selene asked with mock suspicion. "Okay, maybe more than a few, but there are still lots left for the pancakes." The easy domesticity of the moment would have terrified Selene a year ago, when her identity was so tightly bound to corporate achievement that she couldn't imagine finding fulfillment in anything as simple as Saturday morning breakfast with people she loved. But sitting at the kitchen table that Adrian had built himself, watching him serve pancakes, while Emma chattered about her plans for the day, she realized that happiness had been simpler than she'd thought. It just required the courage to let people love her as she was, rather than as she thought she should be. "Selene," Emma said suddenly, her voice taking on the serious tone that meant she was about to ask one of the profound questions that children specialized in, "Are you going to marry my daddy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Selene felt Adrian's attention sharpen, even though he didn't turn around from the stove. They had talked about the future in general terms, had acknowledged that what they had built together felt permanent and real, but they hadn't yet ventured into specific discussions of marriage and formal commitment. "Would you like me to marry your daddy?" Selene asked, carefully wanting to understand Emma's feelings before offering her own. Emma considered this with the kind of serious deliberation that made her seem far older than 9. "I think so," she said finally. "Because he's happy when you're here, and he's sad when you're not. And also because you're really good at explaining math homework, and Daddy is terrible at it." "Hey," Adrian protested with mock indignation. "I'm an engineer. I'm supposed to be good at math." "You're good at engineer math," Emma said patiently. "You're not good at 4th grade math. There's a difference." Selene laughed, but her attention was focused on Adrian, who had turned from the stove to look at her with an expression that was both hopeful and uncertain. In his eyes, she could see the same question Emma had asked, posed with adult complexity, but fundamental simplicity. Would she choose to make this official, to commit publicly to the family they had been building in private, actually? Selene said, her heart racing as she made a decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. "I was hoping your daddy might ask me that question himself." Adrian's expression shifted from uncertainty to wonder to joy so quickly that Emma giggled. "I think that means yes, Daddy." "I think you're right," Adrian said softly, moving to kneel beside Selene's chair so that they were at eye level. "Selene Veyra, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of helping me raise this remarkable daughter, of building a life that's bigger and better than anything either of us could create alone?" The proposal was simple and perfect, spoken in a kitchen that smelled like pancakes with a 9-year-old as their witness. And Selene realized that this was exactly how it should be, not in some elaborate restaurant or romantic destination, but in the middle of the ordinary, extraordinary life they had been building together. "Yes," she said, and the word came out like a song. Yes, absolutely yes. Emma cheered and clapped her hands. But Selene's attention was entirely focused on Adrian, whose kiss tasted like promises and felt like the answer to questions she hadn't known how to ask. When they finally broke apart, all three of them were laughing and crying simultaneously, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had just committed to. "Can I help plan the wedding?" Emma asked immediately, and both adults could see her mental wheels turning as she contemplated the possibilities. "Of course," Selene said, realizing that she genuinely couldn't imagine planning such an important event without input from the child who had become such an essential part of her life. "But maybe we should eat breakfast first before the pancakes get cold." As they settled around the table to share their meal, Selene marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a woman who went home to an empty penthouse every night, who measured her worth entirely through corporate achievements, who had convinced herself that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Now she was part of a family that had formed through desperation and courage and the kind of faith that couldn't be planned or strategized. The months that followed passed in a blur of wedding planning and corporate restructuring, of blending families and building traditions, of learning to navigate the complex logistics of 2 careers and 1 child, and a love that grew stronger rather than more complicated with time. Selene discovered that having people to come home to didn't make her work less meaningful. It made her more efficient, more focused, more intentional about how she spent her time and energy. Adrian's transition from custodial services to consulting had opened doors he hadn't expected, and within 6 months he was offered a position with an aerospace firm that valued his experience and expertise. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. His willingness to start over at the bottom had ultimately led him back to the industry he loved, but with wisdom and perspective that made him a more effective leader than he had been before. Emma thrived in her expanded family, delighting in having a stepmother who could help with homework and take her shopping for clothes that met both fashion and practical requirements. She served as flower girl at their wedding, a small ceremony held in the garden of the house they had bought together, surrounded by friends who had watched their love story unfold with the kind of wonder usually reserved for fairy tales. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Selene, the Sunday mornings, when she woke up between Adrian and Emma, who had climbed into their bed during the night, the weekday evenings, when they sat around the dinner table sharing stories about their days, the lazy Saturday afternoons when they worked in the garden while Emma played with the dog they had adopted from the local shelter. One evening, exactly 1 year after the gala that had changed everything, Selene found herself standing at the window of their home office, looking out at the suburban street where children rode bicycles and neighbors walked dogs, and life unfolded at a pace that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or board meetings. Adrian appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, and she knew he was thinking about the penthouse she had sold, the corporate lifestyle she had left behind, the image of success she had traded for the reality of happiness. "Only one," Selene said, leaning back against his chest. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me so long to ask you to pretend to love me for 10 minutes. Adrian's laugh rumbled through his chest, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. "Best 10 minutes of my life," he said, "even if they turned into forever." "Especially because they turned into forever," Selene corrected, turning in his arms to face him. "I asked you to pretend to love me, and you taught me what it felt like to be loved for real. And you," Adrian said, his dark eyes bright with the same love she had seen that first night in the corporate bathroom, "taught me that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most impossible requests." As they stood together in the window of their home, surrounded by the life they had built from nothing more than courage and hope, and the faith that 2 broken people could somehow make each other whole, Selene realized that fairy tales weren't about perfect people living perfect lives. They were about ordinary people who chose to love each other through extraordinary circumstances, who found ways to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate disappointments. She had asked Adrian to pretend to love her for 10 minutes, and he had given her a lifetime of real love instead. It was better than any fairy tale she had ever heard, because it was true as the ring on her finger, as real as the child asleep upstairs, as certain as the man holding her in his arms and promising her tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. Sometimes Selene thought as Adrian kissed her goodnight, the most extraordinary love stories began with the most ordinary moments: a CEO and a janitor, a woman afraid of being alone, and a man brave enough to love her anyway. 10 minutes of pretense that became a lifetime of truth. And sometimes that was enough to change everything.